So the topic of today is going to be blood. Blood is very important tissue. It interacts with pretty much every body system that we have. And something unique about it is that it is also the only fluid tissue. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to cover is going to be the functions of blood. Its primary function is to transport. So it's going to carry things all over the body. One of the more obvious things is going to be oxygen. It's also going to transport carbon dioxide, which is a waste, but it's also going to transport other wastes such as urea. I recognize that as like the component of pee, and also lactic acid, which is a byproduct of fermentation in your muscles when you run out of oxygen. It's also responsible for transporting hormones. So if you think about the endocrine system, hormones had to go from one gland to another, or they had to travel to a target tissue so that they could have an effect. And so hormones typically travel in the blood. Blood also transports enzymes. So this is back from first semester. So enzymes make reactions happen faster. So they do that by lowering the energy or the activation energy that it takes for those reactions to take place. It's also going to carry nutrients. So things like vitamins, minerals, glucose, so like sugar for energy. Blood also transports plasma proteins. And then blood is made up of different types of blood cells. So it's also going to carry your red and white blood cells. Another function of blood is that it's going to help regulate different things. So if you think about homeostasis, your body has to maintain some sort of balance, and blood plays a very big role in that. So one thing that it helps regulate is going to be body temperature. It's also going to help keep your pH balance. It's also responsible for keeping a balance of your electrolytes. Two things that I want to note on here is the temperature of blood is about 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. And so blood is slightly warmer than your homeostasis level, and that's just because a lot of heat is, kind of lost as your blood travels, especially to your extremities, so the outer part of your body. And then blood has a pH of between 7.35 and 7.45. Blood also plays a role in protection. And so blood has proteins known as antibodies. It also has the white blood cells, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later. And it also contains clotting factors. So clotting factors are the ones that help stop bleeding to a certain degree. So they help prevent excessive bleeding. So pretty much your blood just travels all around your body in order to, kind of keep checks if there's anything that has gotten into your system that might harm you. Alright, so the structure of blood. We're going to go through and get this to work. There we go. Talk about what it's made of. Alright, so structure. First is that blood is made of two basic components. So it's divided into two categories. The first is the liquid part of blood, and this is known as the plasma, and this makes about 55% of blood. And then the second part is the solids. And this is about 45% of blood, give or take. And we'll talk about some scenarios where, this number is actually a little higher. But the solid part has a pretty fancy name, and this is known as the formed elements of blood. Okay, so something that I want to quickly point out is this picture of some blood that has been drawn, and what this shows is once blood is drawn, they can put it into a centrifuge in order to separate out the different parts of blood. And so you have the plasma, which, like I said, is about 55%. Then you have your red blood cells, which are part of the formed elements. And then you have this tiny, tiny layer, which is composed of the white blood cells and the platelets, which also are part of the formed elements. So the majority of the formed elements is made up of the red blood cells. So the formed elements of blood have fancy names as well. So the first part of the formed elements is the red blood cells. And sometimes you'll see this abbreviated as RBC. RBCs. So your red blood cells are also known as erythrocytes. This is the fancy word, or the fancy name, I guess. The next part of the formed elements is going to be the white blood cells. Kind of like red blood cells, you might see this abbreviated as WBCs. And their fancy word is a leukocyte or leukocyte. And then the last component of the formed elements is going to be your platelets. These are the ones that are responsible for clotting, and their fancy name is a thrombocyte. So we're going to go through each one of these formed elements and talk a little bit more about them. We're going to begin with erythrocytes. Or your red blood cells. Alright, so the first thing is that they are kind of a disc shape. And this is known as bioconcave. So if you think about blood, it almost looks like a donut. It still has the middle part. So it is a bioconcave disc, and it's also known as a nucleate. This means that it has no nucleus. This is a very important adaptation. The reason for this is so that it has a really high amount of space, so that it's able to carry a lot of oxygen. So the nucleus, it's a really, really big part of the cell, and by losing it, it increases space that the cell has in there. This type of cell is also very flexible. So when we go over blood vessels, you'll see that sometimes these cells have to squish through really, really tight spaces and kind of, file in one at a time and kind of bend a little bit. Let's see, what else? These cells live for about 120 days before they have to be recycled. And so one of the reasons that they don't have that very long of a lifespan is because they have no nucleus. So they have no organelle responsible for, kind of coordinating any repairs that the cell needs or anything like that. So that's one of the reasons why they don't live very long. Alright, let's see. So red blood cells, kind of like the name says, they are red in color, but there's going to be two different reds. So you have the very bright red, kind of like this one. So if they're very bright, this means that they are high in oxygen. And if they have like a darker red, that's going to mean that they are low in oxygen. There is a very common misconception that deoxygenated blood is blue, just because, when you look at your veins, they look like they have this kind of blue color. And so this is a myth. Your blood is never, ever, ever blue. The only reason your veins look blue is just, the way that the light hits it and all these other weird things that go on, but your blood is never, ever blue. So the way that your blood is able to carry oxygen is because of a special protein known as hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a protein in blood, or in red blood cells, and it carries oxygen, so that's its primary job, but it also can carry a little bit of CO2. And so if we were to sketch out a blood cell, so once again, it's this kind of disc shape and has a weird indentation in the middle. Inside of it has these kind of proteins and we're going to put oxygen as blue. And so in these, it can carry oxygen and a little bit of CO2. So these little weird things are representing the hemoglobin proteins. Globin. There we go. Alright, so this leads us to a process known as erythropoiesis. I may have misspelled it. But basically, this is just the process of making blood cells. Alright, so erythropoiesis is regulated inside of the kidneys. So remember, those are your little bean-shaped organs, and you have two of them on each side. Or sorry, you have one on each side. And so this process is basically initiated depending on the level of oxygen. Depends on O2 level inside of your body. So if you are low in oxygen, what's going to happen is that the kidneys are going to secrete a protein known as erythropoietin. This is a hormone, basically, erythropoietin. And so what erythropoietin is then going to do is that it's going to go to the red bone marrow. Okay, so if you recall back when we went over the skeletal system, inside of your long bones, you have the marrows. You have red marrow as well as yellow marrow. And so this hormone, erythropoietin, is going to go and it's going to work inside of the red marrow. That's where your red blood cells are produced. And so the red bone marrow then is going to increase the production of red blood cells. And then that in turn is going to cause an increase, running out of space, an increase in O2. So one of the things that can lead to a decrease in the amount of oxygen is something like altitude. So if you ever go to like the mountains and stuff like that, there's a little bit less oxygen available, and so that's one of the reasons why red blood cell count would be increased. Sometimes you hear of like athletes and stuff like that wearing these kind of weird oxygen type masks, and so what they're doing is they're tricking their body into thinking that there's not a lot of oxygen produced, and so more red blood cells are going to be produced. So just to recap, an increase in altitude or a decrease in O2 availability. Probably misspelled this, but that's okay. And so on are some of the reasons why red blood cell production would increase, or erythropoiesis rate would be increased. Okay, so red blood cells, we talked about already, they don't have a very long lifespan, so they only live for about 120 days, is about 120 days. So, alright, and so when they start, kind of wearing down and breaking up and stuff, this is known as hemolysis. It can happen for different reasons, but for now we're just going to stick to them breaking down. Their lifespan is over. And so what I want you to know is the organs where this takes place, or the organs responsible for the breakdown and recycling of RBCs. And so then this is going to happen in the liver as well as the spleen. And so for the most part, iron is recycled. And so iron is part of the hemoglobin. And then the red blood cells are kind of just broken down to parts, and whatever is still working, the body will keep, and any other things that are pretty much done, they're going to be secreted, and that's usually going to be in your poop. You're going to poop out, not pooed, you're going to poop out any bits of blood cells that you can't reuse. A little FYI that I want to point out is the reason why your blood is red, and that's because of this, iron. So if you ever think about metal, If it's exposed or like starts breaking down and it starts becoming like rusted and stuff, it gets kind of this red color. And so the reason that your blood is red is because of this metal. Whenever it's exposed to oxygen, it kind of makes things appear red. And so that's just kind of neat. Okay, so the second type of formed element is going to be your white blood cells, also known as your leukocytes. And so I'm going to show you a picture. And what I want you to do is I want you to put this into your notes, so like sketch out the different types of white blood cells. Okay, so you have 5 types of white blood cells, and so these are going to be broken down into 2 categories. And so you have your granulocytes and your agranulocytes. And so basically that just means that these have these kind of like grainy appearance. And so if you look, they have like these kind of little dots inside of the cell. And agranulocytes don't. So they lack those kind of grainy structures. Okay, so I was able to zoom this in just so you can see a little bit better. Don't worry about writing this yet. We're going to go through and we'll write the structure for each one of these. Okay, so I just want you to number them. So we're going to talk about neutrophil first. So neutrophil is going to be number 1. Eosinophil is number 2. A basophil is number 3. So we're going to go over the granulocytes first, the grainy ones. And then we'll go over the agranulocytes. So lymphocyte is going to be number 4. And then the last one, monocyte, is number 5. Alright, so number 1 is your neutrophil. There we go. This is the most abundant, so this is the majority of your white blood cells. This is also your first responder. So when something's going on, this one's pretty much the one who's going to recognize it first, or show up and try to fix it. Okay. And so this is also known as a phagocyte. And what that basically means is that it's going to eat or consume the invader. So if it detects like bacteria or viruses or something, it's going to basically just consume it. Alright, let's see. The second one is going to be the eosinophil. And this one is not very numerous. This only makes between 1 and 3% of your white blood cells, which already are not a lot. But this is going to lead to inflammation. This is going to be as a response to parasites, as well as like worms or other things that may have gotten into your system. So this is inflammation response to worms or other forms of parasites. So you don't have a whole lot of these. Alright, the next one, number 3, is your basophils. These are the least abundant. And their job is to produce histamine. If you suffer from allergies, you might notice that your medicine has something known as an antihistamine. And so it's basically trying to combat this. Histamine causes inflammation. And inflammation is very important. It's the part of the response that's responsible for recruiting more white blood cells. So basically it's kind of like a call for more white blood cells to go to the area that has inflammation. And so that's kind of its job. So all these three are the granulocytes. So we're just going to go over the other two, the agranulocytes. Alright, so your agranulocytes, we're going to begin with number 4, which is your lymphocyte. And so lymphocytes, there's 2 types, and you might have heard of some of these. Your lymphocytes are divided into either T cells or B cells. So these are the ones that are affected, like if you get HIV. They can't do their job. And so their job is to form antibodies. So antibodies are the ones that are going to kind of just be floating around in your body, and they're going to help detect things that are not supposed to be there. And they also even help fight cancer. So antibodies are just proteins. They act kind of like little flags. Whenever you get a vaccination, what they do is, or one of the things that they can do is have the antibodies for certain things so that your body can learn to, detect them. You also have like memory in your immune system. So let's say you get a cold or a certain type of cold, this month, and you're exposed to it later. Well, you already have the antibodies, and so you might not even notice that you're sick because your body was able to recognize it because of these proteins pretty early on. And so, you don't even know that you were sick. And then the last type of agranulocyte is going to be your monocyte. This is going to be the largest white blood cell. And it basically just travels all over your body, just looking for things that, are broken down or microorganisms. So it detects microorganisms, or let's say, not all bacteria are bad, so I'm going to call them pathogens. So it detects things that are going to make you sick, as well as dead cells. So things that are starting to break down, these monocytes are going to help break it down and keep things running smoothly. So the last form element that we're going to go over is going to be thrombocytes. So if you think back, thrombocytes is the fancy word for platelets. And instead of trying to draw out a blood vessel and all that stuff that goes on, I'm just going to put a picture on here that shows the steps of something known as hemostasis. So hemostasis is basically just the process so that you don't lose blood or too much blood that you die. To prevent excessive bleeding. Alright. Alright, so hemostasis is just a process that's going to start whenever a blood vessel is punctured. So this would be the first thing that happens. There's an injury. So let's say you have a cut, or you stepped on something. And so this injury to the blood vessel, what it's going to do, it's going to lead to something known as vasoconstriction, which just means, like you can see here, that the vessel is going to shrink so that not, all this blood starts gushing out. And so that's the first thing. And so when there's injury to the blood vessel, it's going to basically call out to the platelets that are already floating in the blood. So these little things here. And the platelets are going to come to the injury site. And so when the platelets come to this injury site, it's going to basically cause them to start getting stuck together. And so that's the second thing, is that this plug is going to be formed. And so this plug is just a temporary stopper. And you have to keep in mind that these plugs, or these clots, they're just a temporary solution. You don't want platelets to start just, piling together and forming these clots all over your body, because it's dangerous if it, happens permanently. And so then this platelet plug is going to, kind of just help so that you don't bleed forever and ever. And then eventually it's going to form a clot. And so that's going to be the third part. Let me pick a different color. Alright, so this clot formation is going to pretty much just stay in place until the tissue is able to repair itself. And then once the tissue has been repaired, then, the tissues, your blood vessels and stuff, is going to send out signals for this clot to start to break down. This is just a very basic overview of hemostasis. So just make sure you kind of know blood is going to, not flow as much. Platelets are going to kind of be called together to form a little temporary stopper, which is your platelet plug. And then the clot is going to be in place until the tissue is able to repair itself. And then the last thing is going to be that tissue will send out signals for the clot to break down once everything is fixed.